And I'm going to turn it over to Yuill, who's going to present first. Then Ian's going to take the baton and then transfer it over to Jade as well. And anytime you have questions, please just put them in the chat section. We will have ample time for Q&A after the presentations. But if there's something specific to a slide, I will kind of interrupt and then ask the presenters just to speak to that question directly. But don't be shy, because I know if you're like me, you might forget your question. So just throw it into the chat question, and then we will have time after the presentations. So thank you so much, Yuill, for taking the time to share how you've been working with municipalities and the expertise that SSG has gained. And sharing that with municipalities to help them wrap their head around carbon budgeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Gabby. And I feel like this subject is very dull in comparison to making maple syrup, but I'll do my best. And I agree with braiding sweetgrass and also the fungal network are both fascinating themes that I've been following carefully as well. So carbon budget, I've subtitled this "An Idea for Which the Time Has Come." It probably came quite a while ago, but it's never too late. But we've been fortunate to work with a number of municipalities in Canada on carbon budget. And I saw Jeremy's on the call, and we first worked with Peel to start to explore the idea, and then Edmonton, Calgary, Durham, Whitby, and a few others as well. And so it's really an emerging field, and we drew on inspiration from other municipalities internationally, which I'll talk a little bit about. So why a carbon budget? Most cities and other levels of government are not achieving their GHG targets, and we see this in the analysis that we're doing with municipalities across Canada and beyond. Most emissions trajectories are fairly flat, except for where other policies have resulted in reductions, and also setting aside the impacts of COVID. And so we know flat is nowhere near good enough, particularly in this time when we have very few years left to reduce emissions. Why are they flat? I think, and we've been arguing, that the way in which we're setting targets and trying to achieve those targets isn't working that well. The GHG targets themselves are insufficient. This applies to all levels of government. Canada's target is 40 to 45% by 2030, for example. But an equity-based target would likely be more in the range of 60 to 75% by 2030, and that means that there's very little time left. And so targets are insufficient. Most cities and really everyone else in society are making investments that make it even harder to achieve those targets. And that can take the form of a new building, which has a natural gas boiler with a life of 15 years. But we have to replace that boiler before 15 years, or the purchase of a diesel bus that may have a lifetime of 20 years. We can't afford to make those kind of purchases anymore. And so that sort of business as usual in the investment and policy landscape of municipalities is continuing and making it harder and harder to reduce the emissions quickly like we need to. The last, I think, shift in the paradigm, which has really happened in the last 3 or 4 years, is that we're now not so focused on long-term targets in terms of a 2050 reduction or 2030 reduction, but focused on cumulative emissions. And in the cumulative emissions paradigm, every single ton counts. And so the trajectory which we reduce emissions is as important as the end target. So the trajectory means the emissions of every single year and how they add up, and the cumulative emissions. And that really emphasizes the need for a carbon budget. The inspiration for the carbon budget approach came, for us at least, from Oslo. And Oslo had the insight that we have a bunch of people in municipalities who count things all the time. They add them up. They report on them in a transparent way. Sometimes they achieve the target, sometimes they don't, but they have a whole system for doing that. And that's really the finance department within a city. And so why not use that same mechanism to manage GHG emissions if we're actually serious about targets? So in 2016, they created this notion of a carbon budget. I saw a presentation that they gave at the city's IPCC conference that Edmonton held, I think in 2018 or 2019. And was captivated by the methodology and way in which they were implementing it. And so we've been looking and trying to advance the idea in the Canadian context, and many cities in the UK and others have also been pushing the carbon budget approach. And C40 currently has a pilot project with a number of cities internationally. not only cities, but the UK methodology is also really important in terms of inspiration. It's an independent commission that sets a carbon budget every 5 years for the UK. And they are, by law, required to hit their targets. The government has to respond to the carbon budget as to how they're going to stay within it. And if they miss it, or if one area of the country misses the carbon budget, that reduction needs to be made up somewhere else within the country, within a different sector, for example. So that's kind of the gold standard approach, and one that we also look to for inspiration. There's two components to a carbon budget. One is the target element, and that's an annualized target or a cumulative target. And it aligns with science where possible. And there's guidance from the science-based targets for cities that helps to set what those carbon budgets look like, which is the guidance that's used from the Global Covenant of Mayors. The second component, which is the focus of this discussion, is the management system. How do you actually implement the carbon budget? The objectives that we've identified are similar to any management system that a city or any other organization might put in place. The very first one is alignment, so that there is consistent decision-making with respect to financial and policy decisions and GHG targets. And we don't see that consistency in really any organization out there right now. Accountability, which means not necessarily penalizing those who don't achieve their carbon budgets, but at least being transparent about it so that people can make informed decisions, and those decisions and the implications of them are apparent to the constituents, in most cases, the citizens of a city or municipality. One element that we've been working with some municipalities on is recognizing community efforts. Most targets are community, or GHG carbon budgets are community scale. And so there's no reason why, say, a business or a neighborhood who wants to undertake some sort of GHG mitigation action can't feed that contribution into the overall accounting framework. And so we've been trying to design accounting frameworks that can account for all actors and all of the activities that those actors might undertake to reduce emissions. Transparency is a critical piece, and that's really the heart of the accountability mechanism. Since there's no legal or regulatory requirements for carbon budgets, transparency is the key way in which we know whether we're getting anywhere or not. And the last piece, which I think I'd highlight as being really critical in all the projects that we've worked on, is organizational transformation. Implementing a carbon budget is a whole of organization approach, and it's a culture shift. And that means that you're changing people's behaviors, their job descriptions, the management regime, and so on. And that's a lot of work. And I don't think we can understate how much work. And I'm sure Ian and Jade will highlight that. The ingredients of a carbon budget are as follows. I think most organizations are governed by policies, so a policy empowers the implementation of a carbon budget. Not only a policy, but the policy also needs to be supported by the governance structure, which typically starts with council, but also the senior leadership. And then there's a bunch of sort of practical elements around quantification, which I think it's easy to get hung up on, but we at least have been trying to say, don't worry too much about that. We need to give us at least an indicator of how much emissions, but we don't need to be precise. Like, that's not what this is trying to achieve. A mechanism for tracking, a mechanism for public reporting. And the last piece is really about cultural change within the organization, framed as engagement. So in developing a carbon budget, these are the questions that we start by asking. Who's actually, what are the steps involved? We're really trying to copy the financial process. So what are the steps involved in developing the financial budget? Who's responsible for those steps? And let's talk to them about how that all works. What projects, or how are projects identified for financing within a city, for investment within a city? So again, let's look at that process and understand how we can integrate GHG into that process. How are the projects selected, or what are the financial attributes of those projects? So what's the mechanism that the city's developed for doing that? And we've seen several different interesting mechanisms that can really easily integrate consideration of emissions within them. And I would again emphasize that this is an organization-wide process, and part of the objective of a carbon budget is to ensure that everyone in the organization is trying to find opportunities to reduce emissions and considering the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions in their work. So some of the key sort of elements for implementation that we've encountered, and I think again, Ian and Jade will talk about this, but a phased in approach, so not doing everything at once. Although again, time, it's urgent, so there isn't a lot of time to figure it all out. The policy is important in terms of giving the authority to staff to actually make this happen. Having a project lead who's actually in finance, and this is an insight from Oslo, putting the CFO or someone within finance in charge of the process can really help, in particular in making it an organization-wide effort. Aligning with the budget in terms of timing, a lot of municipalities use 4-year budgets, so that makes sense from a carbon budgeting perspective as well. There's some complications about how to integrate this into procurement policy, but that's a key piece to look at right away within municipality. How do you make sure that those procurement decisions don't lock in emissions and therefore lock in increases in carbon expenditures, as it were, and then a process for ongoing evaluation. Some of the interesting dividends that we've encountered, I think, is that there's all of this untapped leadership within municipalities. And these are people who really want to take action on climate, but have not had the mechanism to do so. And we found 2 CFOs who fit that category exactly. They're really empowered by the carbon budgeting, and I think they'll do remarkable work. And this framework empowers them to do that. And similarly, we encountered people in asset management, facilities management, and fleet, all who wanted to take action, but weren't really given a mechanism to do so. So I think that's been one of the fascinating pieces of the carbon budget development process. So here's a couple of the success factors. I already talked about the champion the finance department. The GHG quantification is a big hang up, and we are, I think, doing some work to try and overcome that piece, which will hopefully benefit everyone if that all works out. Community involvement, so that community piece and can account for activities within the community, but also so that the community feels like they're part of it and understands how it works. Of course, support from council is critical. We've seen that in every municipality that we've worked with. Where that support isn't there, it's really hard to move a carbon budget forward. And then transparency. And I think the last piece I wanted to talk about quickly was that this isn't just about leadership. It's increasingly about risk management. And that means that for Edmonton and Calgary, it's an existential risk because the energy transition could phase out their primary chunk of the economy. And so managing that risk is critical to the success of their future. And prudent financial management, I think we see the carbon price really changing the economics of natural gas in particular relative to electricity. So it actually can save money fairly quickly. And then the last one, which is an emerging issue, is really liability. And municipality or governments around the world are increasingly being sued for not meaningfully responding to climate change. And so carbon budgeting is considered a meaningful response. And with that, I will pass it over.
Thanks so much, Yuill. Thank you. And if you can just stop sharing, and if you have any issues with that, just let me know and I can, oh no, all good. Perfect. Thanks so much. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian, who's going to give a little bit of insight into the journey that Durham Region has been going through thus far in advancing carbon budgeting within the corporation, as well as next steps that Durham has in its on its radar. So take it away, Ian. You there? You might just, let's see where you are. You're muted, Ian. Just
there we go. I just lost my controls when I went full screen prematurely. So there you go.
It's all good.
Thanks.
Take it away.
Thanks, Gabby, and appreciate the opportunity to chat about the Durham Region experience over the past, I guess, just shy of a year with our trying to operationalize our carbon budget management framework. I would be remiss without acknowledging significant contributions from staff, a couple of whom are on the line here. I think we've got Melanie Kowalik, who works with me in the CAO's office on sustainability, and then Vidal Guerrero, who's in our finance department, who's really sort of the carbon accounting guru internally. So just to, I guess, build on Yuill's point about needing some leadership in finance, that's been a key asset that we're lucky to have here in Durham. So again, my presentation very much reflects very much a live conversation internally, a work in progress. And I would say that I think we're making some advancements internally, but it's by no means perfect. And I guess perfect being the enemy of the good. Sometimes we're hoping to make some good work happen and build the literacy across the organization, right, which I think is happening. So just to start the story, we did have a corporate climate action plan approved in March of last year, which for the first time set corporate greenhouse gas reduction targets for the region, which you can see highlighted there. Importantly, very much near-term targets, 2025, 2030, and then a net zero target by 2045. And the reason here, this was coming out of our climate emergency declaration, which particularly noted a need for, or a direction to establish a leadership position for the regional corporation in the context of community-wide climate action. So we have the targets, and then as well direction to incorporate these targets into the annual business planning and budget process, which is what I'm going to talk about in the slides that come. Really, how we've done that over the past, I guess, 8+ months as part of the 2022 budget process and updates to the 10-year capital plan. So just to reiterate, I mean, our carbon budget management framework is focused on corporate climate action. It's where we have a high degree of influence, a lot of certainty around emissions accounting. It's important for credibility and to show that the changes we're asking for within the broader community are technically and financially feasible. We need to recognize, of course, that municipal emissions are a small slice of the community-wide. In the context of Durham, we estimate the region's emissions are about 3% of total community-wide emissions. That could go up to 5% if we include all of the local area municipalities. So a small share, and that really through policy, investment and programs, we do have influence over that community-wide emissions profile. And there's some important trade-offs here, and I think it reflects a bit of an imperfection in the way that we're approaching our framework with the corporate lens, and that it is missing opportunities for sort of trade-offs where, for example, increases in transit service and corporate operating emissions in our bus fleet could reduce community emissions more so than the corporate increase. And so we are recognizing the sort of the imperfection and the need to iterate and evolve this carbon budget management framework over time to ideally broaden the scope into sort of those scope 3 emissions accounting areas, so that we can really truly reflect the impact of municipal decision making. But we really decided to bite off what we could chew in this first round. So again, iterative process. The region's corporate GHG footprint, I'm showing two different lenses on this. One is our total corporate footprint, including non-energy emissions. And the one on the right is really just focused on our energy related emissions. So you can see it's radically different, i.e. our total corporate emissions are dominated by solid waste management. Namely our legacy closed landfills, which are waste decomposition, emitting methane, et cetera, as well as the Durham York Energy Center, the waste energy from waste facility. So that's, you can see there more than 60% of our emissions totally in total. But when we look at energy related emissions only, we're seeing Durham Region Transit, our bus fleet, we're seeing our water sewer system, water pumping, water treatment, social services, our long-term care homes, our housing portfolio, our low income housing portfolio, et cetera. So it's a radically different approach. We are applying our carbon budget management framework to the total corporate emissions profile, which again has some challenges and opportunities. In terms of what this looks like, again, I say here on the title of the slide, in theory, and I say that because I think me being relatively new to the municipal budgeting process, I didn't realize how it is an iterative process. It is not a scientific rational process necessarily, as I'm sure many people on the line here can appreciate. As when it comes to budget time, particularly in an election year, things don't always go to plan. But anyways, what what our management process looks like in theory really starts with a mandate to the region, to regional staff from council and from the chief administrative officer that really stems from our annual climate update report. So we provide an update to council on our corporate emissions for the prior year, as well as a forecast under business as usual and business as planned, really to provide a sense of how close or far we are from meeting our next target, in this case 2025. And really, given that it's a gap, i.e. we're short of the target, really provides direction to programs and business units to up their game and to identify additional opportunities within their annual budgets and capital plans. So that's really the kickoff to the process, say in Q1 2020, well, in this case, Q1 2022, as we're gearing up for this. Then that sort of kicks off the budget planning process and the 10-year capital plan update, where the departments really work on putting forward their projects and budget proposals. So there's a lot of work that happened, and that did happen in that sort of mid to late year last year, in terms of working with business units to help them identify projects, find capital, as well as do some accounting, emissions accounting, to help build that picture of what the carbon forecast to 2025 was going to look like. That then led to, I mean, it's saying July to September here. It really ended up happening more towards the latter part of the year last year, where we had a briefing with our senior management team directors to show them where the emissions trajectory was headed, given current budget plans and 10-year capital plan, and that really then provided, as departments were tasked with realigning their budgets with the guideline, the property tax guideline increase, i.e. cutting budgets from what their preliminary submissions were. It really then provided impetus to prioritize those initiatives that were, energy low carbon related, whereas maybe in the absence of this carbon budget management framework, those initiatives might have been more likely to drop off through the guideline alignment process. So where we're at, right? Well, and then we move into the study phase, and this is where, for any sort of prospective initiatives, we have some preliminary carbon accounting completed, but then a need to do some deeper feasibility study and analysis. So that's underway for a number of our larger scale initiatives that I'll talk about. That then leads into the next update report, which we're working on right now. It's going to our committee of the whole in February. Again, providing that burning platform to act and implement more. So at the highest level, this is what our forecast looks like. Between 2019 and 2020, our emissions did increase, mainly COVID related, outside of our control of operating unit control. Stay-at-home orders, people were generating more waste at home that were managed through the Durham York Energy Center, so substantial emission increases there. Nonetheless, we are plotting and seeing reductions across most operating areas, solid waste management being the key one, where we're looking at addressing some emissions in our landfills and moving forward with anaerobic digestion. Water, sewer, we're seeing some energy efficiency upgrades and much more to come here. Retrofits in our housing portfolio, police, fleet transitions, transit, same. So again, there's work happening across the area, but still a fairly substantial gap between our 2025 targets. So that's really to be expected, I think, in this first round, and again provides that so-called burning platform and impetus for departments to look more deeply at their budgets and capital plans. So it really is helping to create that accountability, if not internally as well, accountability to council and to the community, given that this report will be made public, and also helps to build alignment. So just there's another way to look at the same data where we're seeing some of these major reductions forecasted to come from. Renewable natural gas. This is creation of our anaerobic digestion facility and potential plans to credit that production against our corporate fossil natural gas consumption. The landfill biocover I mentioned. We're seeing in facilities, the challenge here, fairly small. The challenge here is that we're building new buildings in the forecast out to 2025. Police facilities, paramedics, Durham region's growing very rapidly. And so that's a challenge for sure, even though we're planning these to be, quite low carbon, they're not quite net zero. So they're adding to the footprint at the same time that we're reducing through retrofit. So that's going to continue to be a challenge for us, absolutely. Given, thinking about long-term care, affordable housing, all of the things that municipalities are expected to deliver on, unless it's zero carbon, it's taking us further away from that trajectory, which I'm sure everyone knows. Nonetheless, we are plotting us being about 2/3 of the way to achieving our 2025 target, which I'm cautiously hopeful about in terms of us being able to layer on additional actions over the coming years. And what that looks like is really, I think, the carbon budget management framework really provided a view on where there's alignment, misalignment, provided that accountability and transparency, and really, I think, helped to provide the rationale for decarbonization plans at the operating area level. And so what we're seeing is our solid waste management division is implementing a long-term waste management strategy with corporate greenhouse gas emission reductions at the core. Water wastewater services are also developing one that's going to look at biogas opportunities in wastewater, as well as energy conservation demand management in water supply. Our Durham Region Transit's developing a roadmap to 2045 to align with our net zero target in terms of zero emission bus acquisition and infrastructure. Our facilities team is developing a standard that will align with the Whitby Green Standard. Thanks, Jade. So there's a lot going on there that I think, as in the next iteration of this, I'm hopeful we're going to see that gap narrowing. We recognize there's much more need to support staff with training and tools on GHG calculation at the sort of initial project planning design stage, and we are working on developing this potentially in collaboration with other municipalities across the country. We're recognizing a need for enterprise-wide energy tracking and reporting. I know Peel's been great at this. York, we've talked to a couple of you about what approaches you've taken and are looking to move forward with this. The reality is all the different departments, both on the facilities and the fleet side, have varying energy tracking and reporting, which makes it a much more manually intensive process. And then finally, on this slide at least, the expansion of the corporate footprint to include Scope 3 emission categories. So this is what I'm getting at in terms of broadening the aperture of our emissions accounting to include some of those value chain or indirect emissions that we influence either through procurement, like our contracted waste hauling, but as well to account for our potential to influence emissions in the community. I wouldn't say, offset or credit, but maybe how we can demonstrate how regional investment helps to avoid emissions in the community. I'm thinking particularly in waste, which is an area that, again, we are managing the waste streams at the end, which inevitably is going to have some greenhouse gas emissions footprint. So it's really, how do we get upstream and help influence waste reduction and reuse, et cetera. So that's something we are looking at as well. Lessons learned. Obviously, interdepartmental engagement is key, and as I mentioned at the outset, the really critical role, and again, thankful for the role that finance has played on carbon accounting forecasting, as well as integrating a carbon lens into the budget submission process. This is both a top-down and a bottom-up process, i.e. top-down in that, from the CAO's office, we have set targets that frame the level of ambition and sort of integrated that in the budget process. But there is that bottom-up process, of course, and just to sort of support what Yuill said about how I think there's been a lot of ideas that have come out of the woodwork from lower levels at the operating level that might not have surfaced were it not for the burning platform of a 2025 target and a gap and the like. And so it's a complex, messy process, but I think really the fundamental change here is about organizational culture change, I think, and I think we're starting to see that happen. The carbon and climate literacy is really key, and I think we're still trying to work on that in terms of understanding, thinking more ahead about carbon offsets and accounting for emissions avoidances. There's some work to do on that. And I think as well, something we're all facing as well as challenges with addressing population-driven emissions. And again, I speak to wastewater, water treatment. Durham region is set to double in population over the next 30 years. How we do that while aligning with a zero carbon trajectory, both corporately and community-wide, is really an outstanding question, and the significant capital requirements for decarbonization, municipal fiscal capacity, recognizing property tax cannot increase by, well, at least politically we're seeing challenges in terms of getting property tax increases even above 3% annually. So there's a lot of questions and challenges here on the capital side. Certainly federal government investment is going to be key, and hopefully provincial investment. We do have a dedicated internal funding stream, or climate reserve fund, that has been critical in terms of providing seed funding to help us leverage. But I think there's more needed there. So I'm going to stop there. I may have rambled on a bit too long. I hope that was interesting for people, and I look forward to any questions after Jade. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
And he wasn't rambling at all. It was perfectly. Perfect. We have some great questions coming in, which I'm going to wait until after Jade presents, just to kind of we'll have a really good time for panel discussions and Q&A back and forth. In the meantime, though, I'm going to turn it over to Jade. Jade, thanks so much for taking us through the Whitby journey on carbon budgeting. I really appreciate that. And take it away.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks Yuill and Ian for providing such an in-depth background, because I think that's the first step to understanding carbon budgeting. And I know it's probably only been about 12 months where I've started to hear the word, well, no, maybe about 18 months where I've started to hear the word carbon budgeting in a municipal context. It really is new. So, if anyone has any questions that they feel silly, I just want to emphasize they're not. This is a sharing and learning space, and I know for me that it took a good 6 months to really grasp even what the concept of carbon budgeting means, let alone understanding what it means in the context of a local municipality. So thank you for those great introductions. And I just want to quickly acknowledge, the town of Whitby is situated on the lands of the Scugog First Nations, and we're signed under the Williams Treaty. And what's really interesting about the Williams Treaty is it shares the land of 7 other Indigenous First Nations, and it talks about the sharing of harvesting, whether it be for fish or for food. And I really think carbon budgeting fits really nicely into the meanings of these treaties, in the sense that we're talking about the sharing of emissions, the fair share of emissions, and getting us to that net zero goal. So with that, Zero Carbon Whitby is the name of Whitby's climate mitigation, corporate climate mitigation and energy conservation demand management plan. It really is now a merged strategy and made into one. It was endorsed by council in March of 2021. You may notice a trend between Ian and I will admit that Whitby followed the region in this work. I saw the draft of the work that Ian had been working on at the region, and I'm like, this is what we've got to do too. This makes so much sense. So thank you, Ian, for paving the way, and of course, thank you to Yuill and SSG for allowing us to get this in our local area. So what made us go on this journey? I think Yuill and Ian both covered this, but the town of Whitby, of course, is under the Electricity Act, where we have to create these energy conservation demand management plans every 5 years. We were a little bit late in updating ours due to some staff gapping. And, I was fairly new to the organization, and we were looking at the previous energy conservation demand management plan. which was merged with a greenhouse gas emission reduction plan. And I think that the document was like over 300 pages long. It was super long, super tricky, and I'm pretty sure nobody had picked it up after it had been published, or very few people. We knew that we wanted to continue aligning energy conservation with greenhouse gas reduction, but we had also started to realize that they really don't mean the same thing. There are definitely nuances around what we've looked at in terms of energy conservation, and it doesn't always align directly with greenhouse gas emission. But ultimately, the town of Whitby had declared climate change an emergency, and greenhouse gas emissions was essentially our ultimate goal. The other challenge around energy conservation is a lot of the low-hanging fruit has been done. You know, the conversion of lighting and maybe some fairly low-hanging fruit, cheap and easy retrofits that have a 2 to 5 year payback. A lot of that work had been done. But then looking at our existing plan that had like over 200 actions, we also realized that those actions quickly became dated. Technology was emerging. Sometimes we were replacing equipment that wasn't due for replacement because, you know, it was an emergency breakdown. So there was no time to do scoping for a low energy alternative. It was like, quick, we've got to get this piece up and running. And then once that new equipment's in place, maybe other actions could no longer be implemented and so forth. And it really was that kind of connected scenario that kind of led to a bit of a failure in our plan overall. The other challenge is buy-in. I think we all are experiencing strategy fatigue. There are so many strategic documents out there. They're coming from different departments. You know, when they're being developed, there's a lot of support, but when it gets to the implementation, I feel many of us hit that roadblock, and it becomes really hard to continue that momentum throughout the duration of the plan. The other challenge was, and it was really mainly as a result of our corporate makeup, was marrying capital costs with operating costs. In the situation with the town of Whitby, you know, and I give the example of our facilities team, they're dealing with the day-to-day operations of the facility, the project capital retrofit, they're working with sustainability on energy conservation and so forth. But finance is the one that's processing those utilities and those invoices. And there really isn't a big connection between the project savings from an energy conservation project to the ongoing long-term benefits from the utility. There was just nobody to measure that. And then of course, I think everyone can attest to this, is just there's so many conflicting priorities between asset management, budget. It's really hard to sell some of the actions that need to happen in an organization, and that sharing of responsibilities and resources. And at the end of the day, it came down to this. We were not meeting our greenhouse gas emission targets. And at the time, I believe it was a 15% reduction over a 5-year period. So pretty minor, really, considering the opportunities that were in place. So this was really the why. So what was really unique about the approach that SSG took in helping us on this journey was, I like to call it reverse engineering a climate mitigation plan. Having worked on a few of these strategies now, you know, traditionally you start with the greenhouse gas inventory and then you set your target and you identify your actions. Whereas climate mitigation can be a lot more straightforward than that, in the sense that science is already telling us what the target is. So this fair share approach to setting the greenhouse gas emission target meant that there was no questions as to why the target is as aggressive as it is. And looking at the long-term target and working our way backwards, it painted us a bit of a journey that we needed to go on in terms of starting to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So for the town of Whitby, it's much smaller than the region of Durham in terms of its corporate operations. But between 2011 and 2050, you know, our fair share of emissions left remaining is 62.6 kilotons. So it's not a lot. But having that to start off with kind of gave us that endpoint to start that journey, or gave us our destination. This is what the town of Whitby's inventory looks at a high level. And I want to emphasize, high level is absolutely fine for carbon budgets. You do not need to get into the weeds and specifics. Budgets don't get into the weeds and specific. They're ballpark numbers at best, especially when you're looking at long range budgets. So business as usual scenario, you can see for us, like facilities really are the bulk of our emissions. We of course operate a number of recreation facilities, That's really our primary energy consumer, but we have administration buildings, operations depots, and so forth. Fleet is our second largest consumer, and then we have lighting and waste. And waste is specific just to our corporate waste, not the waste we collect at a community level. That would be considered in our community inventory. So even with the policies we already have in place and the targets we already have in place, you can see under a business as usual scenario, we would continue to increase, and this factors in growth as well. But in order to meet the fair share target, which is net zero by 2045, we need to start drastically decreasing. And you can see that that line goes down at a fairly rapid rate. And this is effectively is like your pathway for a carbon budget. And going into the next slide, you'll see here, this is the trajectory that SSG created for the town of Whitby for our carbon budget. So it follows that trajectory to net zero by 2045. But it takes place in 4-year increments. And 4 years is strategically selected for the town of Whitby because, of course, it aligns with this thing called municipal elections, which therefore also aligns with the renewal of council goals and corporate strategic plans, which are your overarching governmental documentation. 4 years is also a really good time to allow for projects to start and finish. And especially now we're getting into the more complex carbon actions, we're starting to see that, it's not going to be a 1-year win. Some of those projects are going through engineering and design and then implementation, and then you want a year of monitoring or maybe even more. So 4-year really allows for that project development and implementation, so you can really measure the successes of that decision making. One thing that sat really well with our senior leadership team when Yuill presented the context of the concept of a carbon budget to our senior leadership team was that risk discussion. And one of the things he spoke about was with the rising price on carbon, and ultimately we are going to be legislated to make these reductions in the not so near future. By getting on board with the carbon budget now, we are really moving forward rapidly with risk avoidance. And I love this illustration that SSG created on avoiding the cliff, because by 2030, we're going to be in emergency mode when it comes to drilling down our GHG emissions, which means everybody is going to be trying to implement retrofits at a rate we've never seen. And money is going to be thrown at these types of initiatives at rates we've never seen. So it's going to be more costly. So by avoiding this cliff, this drastic drop, and making those incremental steps, we're being more fiscally responsible towards our greenhouse gas emission goals, but also not also putting that like sudden threat on the tax base or any other costs that come into the municipality that fund these projects at the end of the day. I also want to highlight the identified measures, the pink line on these charts. We completed 20 energy audits across our major facilities before we started this project. Energy audits are different to a low carbon budget pathway. They identify energy conservation measures, and they're typically done over a short period of time, in this case, 5 years. We realized that with energy efficiency alone, we are not going to meet those targets. So one of the outcomes of the carbon budget process is that we are going to essentially need to retrofit 4 to 6 of our own corporate buildings every year from now until the year 2045 in order to meet those targets. So some fairly substantial changes. Now, I do want to emphasize that some of those buildings are tiny little washrooms or really small rental halls. It's not retrofitting 4 to 6 major arenas every year. But, we do have to start planning in the future for when those retrofits are going to take place, because we know from a financial perspective, we're going to have to stagger when it happens. From a governance perspective, in the Zero Carbon Whitby Plan document, there's 2 charts that look at this. There's one that kind of looks at roles and responsibilities, but then there's also the role of how the carbon budget flows through the organization. And I wanted to share how the carbon budget flows through the organization. So, it really comes from top down, but also bottom up in terms of how strategy turns into action and action turns into strategy. So starting at the top, council and the CAO, they set the carbon budget, which we have identified in the plan, but they publicly endorse it and essentially also endorse the fiscal budget on an annual level. Moving down to the bottom, It's our external advisory committees that help advise staff at the department level on what they would like to see within the organization. And this could be through specific committees or even just things like our general customer service surveys that we do once a year. And this advisory goes into the department staff program lead development of specific projects and actions. No different than when you're developing budget, you're developing budget line items. And that is developed with the support of the sustainability team. So we are here acting as an advisory role from the modeling perspective. And I will emphasize that the Town of Whitby sustainability is a team of 2. So we are doing that in-house. And then the financial services piece is doing the accounting. So this is what's really interesting with the carbon budgeting is the sustainability team is doing the modeling to determine the greenhouse gas emission factor if we're not able to do it through things like our procurement documents, or if it's a little bit more than a high level complication. But then we essentially are going to pass that number over to financial services and they're going to turn it into a dollar amount. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Once the action items have been developed though, and the carbon emissions have been quantified and the carbon budget has essentially been quantified, this will go up through an internal climate change committee up to the department heads, again, ultimately for final approval. In terms of how that timeline works, the carbon budget has been purposely developed to align with our fiscal budget process on an annual basis. So believe it or not, we start our fiscal budget process for the next year at the end of February, which is when we start, we'll be looking at what our carbon performance was for the year prior looks like, and then also setting our goals for the upcoming year in March. And then we'll be working with the individual departments when they're identifying their projects for the upcoming year. We'll be working with them on the greenhouse gas emissions. We'll then go through a prioritization process, which is when the red pen comes out and projects get crossed off the list. And then we evaluate those projects against not only the fiscal budget, but the carbon budget. We develop the business cases. This essentially is what goes to council for final approval. And then we take our proposed budget to council, and that's usually when they come back and say, nope, your growth rate is only XYZ. So we have to go back with that red pen again. And essentially the following year, the budget is approved. So it really is in sync with our fiscal budget. I talked about how finance is stepping in and doing the price on carbon. So our role in sustainability is going to be quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions. Finance, however, their expertise is in the accounting side of things. So they're going to be looking at the quantified amount of greenhouse gas emissions and applying a price on carbon. So part of Zero Carbon Whitby, we did adopt an internal price on carbon that's consistent with the federal government that reaches $170 per ton by 2030. So it really ensures that our carbon budget not only takes in account a snapshot in time today, but looks at any situations where we could be making investment decisions that result in locking in carbon burdens or even financial burdens in the long run. So by endorsing an internal price on carbon, we're starting to apply a life cycle analysis on pretty much everything we do, which Gabby, for you, I think since I've been talking to you over the last 10 years, green procurement and circular procurement for municipalities is a really tough nut to crack, and carbon budgets could be a really good opportunity to shift how that decision making is done, and this is definitely an opportunity to look at. Financial, I saw a question in the chat about financial impact, and I want to highlight what's on the table here is at a very high level. The Town of Whitby is currently working with SSG for a detailed costing study across everything that we do. But within the strategy, we did include a ballpark level of what the costing impacts could look like. So for new construction, you're looking at 4 to 15% incremental costs. Retrofits for the Town of Whitby's 64 buildings, you're looking at 40 to 60 million. Fleet, there really is a negligible transition because the savings from fuel are already there and they have a shorter life cycle, and I can talk about fleet. But really the big piece will be around your charging infrastructure. And then there's going to be some other things that we haven't been able to quantify. And a lot of that's going to be related to policy and just general staff and human behavior. So these are some high level costs, but it's definitely a good area to start with. But at the end of the day, you do need to figure out a way to fund all of this, and really pleased that from a finance perspective, we've had the buy-in, and we are now actively exploring the development of a revolving climate fund for our internal organizations to start to fund those low carbon actions across the organization. And, in short, that revolving fund can be funded from energy savings or operating cost savings, but to get that fund going, we do need to look at the seed funding to get it going in the first place. So that could be loans, grants, operating budgets, etc. And as part of the Zero Carbon Whitby costing study, which is the really deep dive on the incremental costs, we're going to be coming up with the number we need in order to start that seed fund, and some opportunities of where we can leverage funds for that seed fund to get this policy going. So this is all scheduled to be in place by the end of May, so stay tuned. We have a lot of updates coming. I want to kind of start wrapping up, and this is a big transformation change for Whitby, and it's addressing a lot of challenges. I think I know I've personally seen in other organizations I've worked for. But if you want to be successful in this, is don't get stuck in the data. And I think this aligns with carbon budgeting and asset management. It's so easy to start getting really technical and scientific on quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, but at the end of the day, the effort in doing that may not ever change the outcome in which you're intending to take. So keep it high level, keep it, as ballpark as a financial budget typically is, round those numbers up, and just make sure those numbers help you make the best decision moving forward. You do need to work with finance and senior management for buy-in. And if you have an organization where you don't think you have that right away, make sure whoever you're working with, if you're working with a consultant, is able to speak the language of finance and senior management, because speaking about those risks and talking about it in a different language and not just from the climate perspective can really help translate what this means to them and how and what the other co-benefits are in an organization. And I have to say, Yuill can speak the language of finance in a way I've never seen anyone can. So, I certainly endorse the work and the communication that SSG has done to get this in place in Whitby. You have to align this work with your fiscal budget. This is not going to work as a standalone initiative because it's just too much. It's too much for one team to manage. It's too much for one individual. This has to be a corporate-wide movement. And finally, you need to align this with your asset management plan. As we start to transition to talk about things like embodied carbon, we don't want to be replacing equipment and projects that their lifespan hasn't been maximized where possible. But we also do need to make sure we reach those end goals. So alignment with asset management really is quite critical. And I think you'll find that carbon budgets and asset management speak very much the same language. Co-benefits, and this is more coming from a sustainability climate change expertise perspective. As we take on more in this space, I really want to emphasize the benefit that a carbon budget shifts the responsibility of monitoring and tracking greenhouse gas emissions and reporting those negative updates off of one person to the entire organization. And it makes everybody accountable. And I know Yuill talked about that earlier, but it really is quite transformative in the way that it shifts that culture to applying that climate lens corporate-wide, and it will open the doors to other conversations. And that's what's really been exciting with Whitby's experience. It encourages that collaboration, and that's really important, especially for organizations like the size of the region of Durham, where even the financial process is very fragmented and sits within different departments. By having a process like this, Ian doesn't have to run around to 20 different departments trying to get all those numbers. Like it becomes just part of the process, which is pretty cool. One thing I also think is really hard, especially when we're fighting a long-term game on climate change, is celebrate the small stuff. And carbon budgeting does really allow you to do that. It's really hard to celebrate or get excited about 2045 for many people, but patting yourself on the back up to 12 months of work, and you need it. It's mental health as well. Let's talk day to day. So mental health and it can really help towards that small win piece. And it's a living process. So hopefully this will save you from having to redo another climate mitigation plan in 5 years' time. You'll just need to make some minor tweaks and you'll be successful. Last slide, I promise. Next steps, we're currently undertaking that costing study. It will be available at the end of May, and happy to chat about that. This will prepare the 2023 budget alongside a 10-year capital budget that aligns with our carbon goals. So this is pretty exciting. We're developing that revolving fund. We are also in the process working with SSG again on a community-wide adaptation and mitigation plan, which no doubt will align quite nicely with Zero Carbon Whitby. And we will be preparing to complete climate disclosure in 2023, 2024. And last but not least, I just want to emphasize, there was a question around retrofits. As part of the endorsement of Zero Carbon Whitby, we also adopted Tier 3 of the Whitby Green Standard as a corporate building standard. So moving forward, all new buildings within the town of Whitby or all major retrofits will be moving forward to zero carbon ready. So, you know, that really nice alignment of green development standards and practicing what you preach. This is a really great example where we got internal groups on board with that. So thanks everybody, and look forward to your questions. Over to you, Gabby.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jade. Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Yuill, for all your presentations. We have a lot of questions in the chat that I wanted to kind of get to, but some of the kind of top things that I really got out of this presentation is the role the carbon budgets play in getting all the different departments on board in terms of being accountable and identifying their spheres of influence on addressing the GHG emissions coming from the corporation. And I think one of the key things that really makes a lot of sense is using the carbon budgeting and testing it out to get your own house in order, not just for the sheer importance of that municipal leadership, but also taking it in a bit more of a bite size approach so that you can learn and get some experience as you're advancing the carbon budgeting, but also speaking to the area where the municipality has complete control and authority over its emissions because it manages those services as a whole. So I really did want to kind of certainly there's huge opportunities that I see of this. Thank you so much for taking the time to share and your approach and your journey thus far. Some of the questions that came in for it, I know there's a lot of municipalities that are advancing zero emission buildings, particularly certainly with new builds. Like if you're not kind of planning your new builds to meet your net zero emissions, it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more when you have to inevitably retrofit your building to achieve your GHG reduction targets. So I really bringing that into your decision right from the beginning is so critically important. And the carbon budgeting, I think one of the powerful things about that is, I think, Ian, you mentioned as you're kind of aligning the carbon budgeting with the financial budgeting process, the projects that normally got cut because they weren't part of the core needs of the municipality, like the GHG reduction targets that traditionally got cut from the budget because they needed to get cut. This carbon budgeting process changes that and in many ways prioritizes those carbon reduction initiatives so that it doesn't fall from the same traditional challenge that they've always faced, which is when budget cuts happen, those are the ones that get cut. So I think that's really powerful as well. Okay, so generally the costs associated with advancing a carbon budgeting, and we're going to speak to the corporate carbon budgeting just right now, in terms of like the consulting help, the staff time that it would take you to advance this over the last 12 months. What do you think Durham Region and Whitby spent to advance this effort within your municipality?
Yeah, I think I can start. So, I mean, the consulting assignment to develop the framework, we worked with SSG. Thank you, Yuill. But really, I mean, it was a lot of internal effort as well, because the key thing is aligning with our processes, not sort of applying, you know, Oslo or Edmonton to Durham Region. So a lot of Yuill's work was really working with us to suss out what our processes are, and frankly, our processes were in flux. Our core budget processes were in flux. So that was a challenge. Anyways, cost-wise, I mean, the consulting assignment was south of 50K, if I recall correctly. Not saying that would be directly transferable to others, because your starting point might be different. We already have a fairly advanced carbon accounting framework in place, thanks to our leadership in finance. So I mean, and then it's really staff time, and it's interdepartmental engagement, and so it's really hard to discern costs there. I mean, I think in the chat, I responded to Hillary's question. I think we really have three people, I'd say, that are sort of leading this, not even on a full-time basis, but throughout the budget process. We've got, I mean, and they're here. Melanie, Vidal, and myself have really been sort of leading that. Both the engagement with departments, working through our energy management working group internally, just to develop projects, get data, do the accounting. So I mean, costs are hard. It's hard to discern. I don't think I've got a good answer for that. In terms of like where we had the challenges on facilities were projects that were already in a state of design there, where it was, we weren't going to go back from scratch to start to zero carbon. So there was a paramedics facility and a police facility in particular where we were able to add some extra funding last year through our climate reserve fund to basically enhance the design beyond what would have otherwise been done, but not quite to a zero carbon state. So there's my answer.
How stressful was it, Ian, in terms of cost?
Oh, well, it's ongoing. It's still, I mean, it's not done yet, right? Where we've got this staff report going to committee of the whole, getting everyone on board. Interdepartmentally is a challenge. So it's not easy because it's personal relationships. And a lot of this is, again, organizational change and relationship building. And you don't want to be the sort of the top-down heavy CAO telling everyone what to do. The CAO's office, I'm not the CAO, but the CAO's office telling everyone what to do, right? So it needs to be, it's like a push and a pull, right? You need to be flexible and adaptable with the departments in terms of where they're at, but at the same time, firm in terms of what the goal is. So yeah, it is not easy.
How important was it having council direct staff that this was a process that they wanted as part of their climate emergency declaration and their climate action plan?
Good question. And you know what, I'm not, well, I mean, important and certainly important in some areas. I mean, I think about Durham Region Transit doing their zero emission bus transition plan. I mean, they didn't need, at the staff level, they knew they needed to do that, but having the council direction and the target then provided the framework under which they would proceed with that plan and that scope of work. So define the sort of what the endpoint was, what the target is. So I think it's really, I wouldn't say that staff need to be told what to do. I mean, that is council's role, of course, to provide direction, but and leadership. But I don't think I wouldn't say that we kind of went up to council to tell staff what to do, because in many cases they already know what they need to do, but they need that sort of institutional support and alignment.
Mm-hmm. And then you guys are taking on this and the things of like looking at it from a corporate carbon budget at this point in time. Do you think it would, let's just say a municipality feels that taking on a corporate budget as too is something that they're not ready for just as yet. Do you think it's worthwhile to do it on a departmental level to test it out? Or is it somehow that it kind of is something that all of the municipal approach is really, really important, and you would kind of lean towards that as your kind of options?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, go ahead, Jade.
Yeah, I think it depends on your organization, and it really depends on who your champion is. I mean, I think Whitby was really fortunate where we have an amazing champion in our finance department, so it makes it really easy to look at this at a corporate-wide perspective, but maybe your champion sits in facilities or waste or fleet. And I always say, like, starting small is better than not starting at all. So if that is something that would work for your organization, because you're relying on those personalities more than anything to get this going, I would strongly encourage it. I think it's easier to sell something that has demonstrated success if there is initial pushback. So that would be my approach. I just want to quickly answer the council piece, because I think the local level is a bit different to the corporate-wide level, to the regional level, because in a local level, like there's a few less silos and there's a few less fragments when we're talking about a corporate budget. Like a region is just so huge. And I think the council endorsement is important, but I think, I honestly think it was the senior leadership endorsement that was more important in this situation. And I think it was that upper level management, because council's quite happy to endorse something that, you know, on its face looks really good, but it's harder for senior leadership to endorse something where there is going to be so many challenges with the implementation. So that would be my take on that, is the internal buy-in is just as, if not more important than the council.
Perfect. So I wanted to kind of get into the carbon budgeting in terms of the getting too down into the weeds in terms of the quantification. And I'm going to be facetious on this one, but not really. I'm very much an 80 to 20% girl. Like, I'm honestly at my heart really lazy. And this is not rocket science or brain surgery. So you know what, a lot of times for our kind of work, 80% is good enough. And it's, you know, let's move on. Let's let's move on to this one. Do you think the 80-20 principle also applies, that, you know, in just, you know, you want to get a kind of general range of the GHG implications, but you don't have to be quantification gurus on this one. So I just wanted to kind of figure out how you balance those. I'm going to throw it on to Yuill first, because you've got all the quantification experience, and you probably know how worth it is it really to kind of, you know, good enough.
I mean, it's such a tricky question because we struggle. I mean, some of our climate action planning work, we do these incredibly detailed models and we know what the answers are going to be already before we even do the model. And then we spend 6 months doing it. So it's kind of, I mean, I think you need the evidence that is needed to satisfy those who are asking the questions. And that really will vary from who is asking the question at what point. But I do think we are obsessed with numbers in our society, and we probably, if we just think about it, we do know the answers without having to do all that quantification. So if we can bring that sort of check to whatever decision is in front of us, do we actually know enough to make this decision? Do we need to really figure this out at this level, or can we just do sort of more of a basic calculation, like really applying, I guess, that 80%, 80-20 rule as much as possible, because you can spend a lot of time trying to get that last little detail right, and certainly we have many times, and probably it's not necessary. And I think Jade's example of really thinking about it the same way we do with financial budgets is really helpful, and throwing it in the financial world has been really helpful because it's out of the engineering world, which is obsessed with numbers, and the financial people are less obsessed with numbers. So that's actually been really helpful, I think, for moving more quickly.
Ian, any kind of
I don't know that
the
the financial people are less obsessed with numbers, Yuill. I might challenge you on that one. But.
Sorry, maybe that's not less obsessed with the precision of the numbers. Mm-hmm. Maybe. Yeah, not less obsessed with numbers. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's more important you get accuracy on your actual data, i.e. prior year inventory data, and probably less important around the forecast, because the forecast is really just directional in nature. I mean, a lot of the accounting behind our forecast is, I mean, even just the emissions factors, the provincial grid emissions factors are unknown. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty once you're forecasting out to 2025 to 2030. So I think, you know, it's really directional in nature, and the point is to illustrate that there is a gap and a need for more action. So I think, yeah, I'd say less important on the forecast. It's more directional in nature, more important in terms of reflecting where you're at, or where you were at in the year, the latest year you have data for. But even that said, like our solid waste emissions, our latest data, again, that's modeled emissions data. A lot of it is modeled emissions data from legacy closed landfills. So, you know, it's not, we're not sort of we don't have methane sampling plots at every corner of the landfill, and it's not real-time data. So yeah, I think there's some truth to what you're saying, Gabby.
And then one of the things I think is super powerful, and one of the lessons learned I learned from your presentations, is how much you try to better understand the financial budgeting process and make carbon budgeting fit into that process rather than creating a new process. You're really trying to bring carbon budgeting into that overall financial budgeting process. And I think that was really insightful, because you got to make it fit into the existing stream if you want to get there, get the buy-in you need, and to reduce the work on everybody's. How much did you find that was really critical in your journey?
That was all Yuill, and I have to say, yes, critical. But I know Yuill, you were doing some self-exploration, right, on the Town of Whitby website, looking at our budget process. And I know that circle diagram is actually exactly from the Town of Whitby's budget process, like that, and we molded it. So I would actually, I'm going to pass on to Yuill, because he did all the exploratory work on that for both Durham and Whitby, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, and that was really an insight from Oslo. And because they said how important it was to line up those two processes. And then when we worked with Edmonton, it was a similar story. And we discovered this whole planning world within the financial planning system, which is incredibly sophisticated. So it's really, and I think that's applied to every community that we worked with. So you leveraging that sophistication for GHG emissions, it's just another number in a way. So it's not that hard to transpose it into that system that already exists and it's already been tried and tested for so long. And there's so many neat sort of approaches that we've been discovering in municipalities for prioritization, for project identification, for like management of all of everything that's going on across the organization. And it all sort of hangs out in this financial world that we hadn't really discovered from a climate perspective until we started looking at the carbon budget. So it's like this huge untapped resource for how to manage greenhouse gas emissions.
Perfect.
Yeah, I think I just add, I mean, it is the primary information system around where the region's at, how it's spending money, what its assets are, where that's going to be in 5 or 10 years. So that's really important. And just like, I think the departments would have my head if I was to try to set up a parallel disconnected process. They'd be like, get out of here. Like, they're already overwhelmed, right? Yeah. And so it's really about being empathetic to your staff and to your colleagues to understand that they're up to here, and streamline and make it as efficient as you can, I think. And then the fact that we have our carbon update report going to council at the same time as the budget is really important and impactful as well, right? Because it's they're going to have that transparency. If I could go back to your previous question about around 80-20 and importance of accuracy, I think there's a nuance here that's emerging around opportunities, particularly in carbon offsets in waste and wastewater, which might actually speak to the need for greater sophistication and accuracy in emissions quantification and reporting. If municipalities are, renewable natural gas, methane, other aspects of municipal operations where there's decarbonization opportunities, I think there are markets emerging, voluntary, mandatory, for which better emissions quantification could be helpful to municipal government.
Absolutely, yeah. Certainly, offsets would require a far more sophisticated level of quantification associated with it than a carbon budgeting would require. One of the questions, also the last question before, and I'm not sure, I'm going to try and throw some polls out there. I'm not sure, Juliet, if you can launch the polls or not. I can't seem to do it, but if not, we will send out some feedback just to get an idea of how useful this was for you, and then also what your next questions that came back from this, because this is a journey. No one's expecting kind of like, it's not necessarily a destination that we are going to achieve in the first year. This is going to be a longer term plan, but getting the steps in place, I see huge amount of like I see it as a really powerful tool in identifying, are the decisions that our municipalities making, are they in alignment with our climate emergency declaration, or in misalignment with the climate emergency declaration? That doesn't mean that they are going to be making decisions they're not going to be making decisions that aren't in alignment, but at least they understand that this decision is something that, you know, they may make the political decision that they need to do it anyway, but it is actually going to result in an increase in the gap of what is associated with our GHG reduction targets. And we need to account for that in additional projects or initiatives that we are going to undertake within a certain time frame. In many ways, I kind of see the climate lens. There's the qualitative, which is the education literacy, getting the climate lens, climate implications into council reports so it can serve as an education tool for senior management and for council. Then when you kind of get into the quantification of the GHGs, you start moving into the carbon budgeting. Then when you're looking at your risks and mitigation strategies, you start moving into the TCFD disclosures that municipalities are moving into. And it really is nice to see how these puzzle pieces are coming together, and that you don't have to have the whole puzzle done all at once. You can choose different pieces of the puzzle to work on, and then make gains on that, and then see overall how they all fit together. Any kind of last thoughts from you guys on some of the kind of, you know, one word of advice that you would like to give that you wish someone had given you before you started?
Keep it simple. Really simple, and don't get caught up in the weeds. And if you've got more money than the 50K, spend the resources on organizing internally, whether it be through energy management software with the utilities, building rep screen models. All of those things are going to be really critical for the implementation, and that those can be the pieces that are resource heavy. So focus on that piece. The strategy should be easy and straightforward.
Perfect. Thanks. Ian?
I'm not sure. Nothing's coming up.
That's okay.
I'll
No
keep thinking
worries.
on it.
Yuill?
I think one of the insights that we've gained is that this isn't actually such a hard thing to start, and it's maybe not even such a hard thing to do. And so I think that it's compared to like doing a climate action plan, this is not a huge thing. So I think there's a lot of the resources that are needed already within the organization, and the structure is there. It's just a matter of getting direction to do it. So I mean, obviously there's tons of details in implementation and it's cultural change and everything else, but I don't think it's not a big project to get going.
Perfect. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining today and sharing all of the experiences, expertise, lessons learned on your journey, on carbon budgeting journey with other municipalities who are also trying to go on this journey and trying to avoid landmines that are available, that we can all share our experiences across that network. We are much less likely to avoid stepping in, I could say, landmines or doggy doo-doo, depending on which ways you want to kind of do it, and carrying that stink around to all our other work, as well as trying to build those interpersonal relationships and change the job descriptions within different people within the municipalities to bring climate change into non-traditional climate job descriptions, and how you're going about doing that. So I really appreciate you taking the time and effort to share your experiences and learnings with all the municipalities. I know they all thank you as well for that. I just wanted to let everyone know we're going to be recording this, sharing this, and sending it out via email. If you also have some insights that you'd like to share, if you've been advancing the climate lens and carbon budgeting work within your municipality, please do let us know. And I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you again to all our presenters. Thank you to all of our participants for joining us, and have a great day. And thank you. And I'll send out the email very shortly, or within the next 24 to 48 hours. All right. Thanks, everyone. Speak to you later.
Bye.
Take care.